Peter, what's wrong?
Peter, what are you doing, man?
I think my throat's getting bigger.
It's okay, Charlie. We're almost to the hospital, okay?
The movie opens on the day of Annie's mother's funeral. Her husband, Steve, wakes up their son, Peter, and learns that their daughter, Charlie, has spent the night in the attic. He wakes her up and scolds her for sleeping in the cold. They arrive at the church, where Annie gives a heartfelt speech. She says her mother's life was always a mystery to her and describes their relationship as distant and strained. Meanwhile, Charlie quietly draws an unsettling picture of her mother, but Steve stops her. A little later, Charlie walks closer to take one last look at her grandmother, with whom she shared a special bond. She notices her grandmother's necklace, and as she turns around, a strange man smiles at her, leaving her confused. Charlie then stands staring at her grandmother's body and takes out a chocolate bar. Steve double-checks that it is nut-free, since Charlie has a severe nut allergy. After returning home, the kids go to their rooms. Annie feels uneasy and asks Steve if she should feel sadder, but he comforts her. Later that night, Annie, who works as a miniaturist, creates detailed dioramas that recreate her mother's final days in the hospital. Steve comes in and tells her she should get some rest. Annie goes to Charlie's room, comforts her, and notices her diary on the bed. She picks it up and sees a drawing of her grandmother's dead body. Annie then remembers when Charlie was born and how her mother insisted on taking care of her. Annie tells Charlie that she was her grandmother's favorite, but Charlie replies that her grandmother actually wanted her to be a boy. The conversation becomes awkward when Charlie asks who will take care of her now. Annie reassures her that she is there for her. While in the room, Annie is shocked to see the word Satiny written on the wall. Later, Annie goes to her workshop and looks through her mother's belongings. She finds a book with a letter addressed to her. In it, her mother writes about her regrets and says that their sacrifices will eventually bring them rewards. As Annie prepares to leave, she notices what appears to be her mother standing in the corner. She freezes in fear. When she turns on the light, no one is there. Confused and shaken, she returns to bed but hides what she experienced from Steve. The next day at school, Charlie plays with her toy during a quiz. The teacher tells her to focus and complete the test first, but Charlie seems uninterested. Suddenly, a pigeon crashes into the classroom window, frightening everyone except Charlie. Meanwhile, Peter keeps staring at his crush, Bridget, during class. He receives a message from his friend, who starts making plans for their break. The teacher notices Peter is distracted and calls him out. During the break, Charlie walks over to the dead pigeon and cuts off its head using a pair of scissors from the classroom. As she turns around, she sees her dead grandmother standing there, smiling and waving at her. Back at home, Annie notices that her mother's room is unlocked. She feels uneasy and hesitates before going inside. Worried, she rushes to Steve and asks if he opened it, but he denies it. Steve locks the room again and tries to comfort Annie. Just then, Steve receives a call from the cemetery. He is informed that his mother-in-law's grave has been desecrated, which shocks him. When Annie asks what happened, Steve hides the bad news from her. Later, Annie tells Steve she is going to watch a movie, but instead, she arrives at a support group meeting. At the support group, Annie is welcomed warmly and encouraged to introduce herself and share her story. Though hesitant at first, she explains that she is there because of her mother's death. She says she loved her, even though their relationship was strained. Annie reveals that her mother suffered from dissociative identity disorder and dementia. She also shares that her father starved himself due to a psychotic condition, and her brother committed suicide at the age of 16. In his letter, he blamed their mother, claiming she was putting people in his mind, which drove him to take his own life. Annie admits she tried to stay away from her mother for years, but eventually her mother moved in with them. She says she protected her son from her influence, though she still feels guilty about it. However, she allowed her mother to take care of her daughter, Charlie, which made her feel even more guilty later, as she describes her mother as manipulative. That night, Peter receives a text from his friends inviting him to a party the next day. Meanwhile, Charlie quietly plays with her toys when a strange beam of light catches her attention. She looks out the window. Around the same time, Annie gets a message from her employer asking for an update on her current project. As she prepares her work for photographs, Peter comes in and asks for permission to use her car to attend the party. Annie agrees but insists that he take Charlie with him. Peter goes looking for her and finds Charlie walking barefoot into the woods. She suddenly stops and sees a vision of her grandmother sitting in the middle of a fire. Just then, Annie appears and quickly brings her back inside the house. Later, Annie tells Charlie to get ready for the party. Charlie hesitates, saying she doesn't have any friends there, but Annie persuades her to go with Peter. In the evening, they arrive at the party. Peter immediately notices Bridget and becomes distracted. He approaches her and asks if she wants to smoke with him. She agrees, and as they head toward another room, Charlie follows Peter. He asks her to wait for him, but Charlie looks unsure. Eventually, Peter notices a chocolate cake and tells Charlie to grab a slice and enjoy it while he returns to his friends. He stays busy with them and intentionally ignores Annie's calls. Suddenly, Charlie runs to him, gasping for air and saying she can't breathe. Peter realizes the cake contained nuts. Panicked, he rushes her to the car and drives off quickly. Terrified, he watches her struggle in pain. Charlie rolls down the window to get some fresh air, hoping it will help her breathe. As Peter speeds down the road, he suddenly notices a dead deer lying ahead. He swerves to avoid it, but in that moment, Charlie's head hits a roadside pole. Everything goes silent. Peter stops the car, frozen in shock. He is too afraid to turn around and see what has happened. After a long moment, he slowly drives back home. Instead of telling his parents, he goes straight to his room and lies in bed, unable to process what just happened. The next morning, Annie goes outside and discovers Charlie's lifeless body in the car. Her heartbreaking screams fill the house while Peter lies awake in his bed, listening in horror. Annie collapses in grief, while Peter remains silent, overwhelmed with guilt. After the funeral, the family is completely shattered. Annie spends most of her time in bed, unable to cope. Steve quietly enters Charlie's room and looks at her drawings, filled with sorrow. Peter drifts through his days in a daze. Even when he tries to hang out with his friends, he feels a sharp pain in his chest, as if the guilt is physically crushing him. One night, Annie returns to the support group but cannot gather the courage to go inside. As she prepares to leave, a mysterious woman named Joan approaches her. Joan says she recognizes Annie and gently asks about her mother's death. Annie, shaken, explains that she was originally there because of her mother, but now she is grieving her daughter, who recently died. Joan expresses sympathy and offers to sit with her inside or even grab a coffee, but Annie refuses. Joan then shares her own tragedy. She says her son and grandson drowned together. She admits that the support group cannot erase the pain, but it can make it easier to bear. Before leaving, Joan gives Annie her address and tells her she can reach out anytime. Later that night, Annie struggles to sleep in her bedroom. Unable to rest, she takes her blanket and goes up to the attic, choosing to sleep where Charlie once did. The next morning, Annie goes to Joan's house using the address she gave her. When she arrives at the apartment, she notices a doormat that looks exactly like one her mother once embroidered. Joan welcomes her inside, but when Annie mentions the mat, Joan casually ignores the comment. Joan gently shifts the conversation toward Charlie's death. Annie painfully describes how she found her daughter's headless body, covered in dark, tar-like blood. The memory clearly haunts her. Joan then asks about Annie's relationship with Peter. Annie recalls a disturbing incident from the time when she used to sleepwalk. One night, she woke up in her children's room, back when Peter and Charlie shared it. She found them both covered in paint thinner, and she was holding a matchbox in her hand. As she slowly came back to her senses, Peter woke up and accused her of trying to kill them. Annie says she could not even defend herself because the situation looked so real and terrifying. That evening, Steve prepares dinner as Peter comes home. Steve tries to talk to him, but Peter ignores him and walks away. When Steve goes to call Annie for dinner, he finds her in her workshop, recreating the scene of Charlie's death through one of her miniature models. He becomes upset, worried that it will only hurt Peter more, but Annie refuses to stop. At the dinner table, the atmosphere is tense and uncomfortable. Finally, Peter asks Annie to say what she is clearly thinking. At first, she denies having anything to say, but as the tension builds, she suddenly explodes. She blames Peter for Charlie's death and accuses him of pretending it was not his fault. She says she wishes she could take away his pain, but she cannot because Charlie is dead because of him. After Annie calms down slightly, Peter fires back. He blames Annie for forcing Charlie to go to the party with him in the first place. This only angers Annie even more, and she storms away from the table. The next day, Annie steps out after shopping and unexpectedly sees Joan. Joan excitedly rushes toward her and hugs her tightly. She pulls Annie aside and says something strange has happened. Joan explains that she attended an open seance where a medium claimed to summon a spirit from the 19th century. Annie does not believe her. Joan continues, saying she later invited the medium to her own house and asked her to contact her grandson. According to Joan, the medium successfully summoned his spirit, and she truly felt his presence in the room. Annie remains doubtful, so Joan invites her inside to demonstrate. Joan lights a candle and asks Annie to place her hand lightly on a glass without applying pressure. She begins speaking to her grandson's spirit, asking it to move the glass as a sign. Slowly, the glass begins to move. Annie watches in shock and fear. As Joan continues communicating, Annie suddenly feels a rush of air through her hair, which frightens her. She quickly looks under the table, thinking it might be a trick, but finds nothing there. Joan then hands the spirit a small chalkboard and asks it to write a message. Moments later, the words, "I love you, Grandma," appear on the board. Terrified, Annie begs Joan to stop and tries to leave. Joan stops her and gives her a written script to read if she ever wants to summon Charlie. She advises Annie to gather her entire family when performing the ritual. Later that night, Annie struggles to sleep. She suddenly notices ants crawling on her bed and across her room. Following the trail, she walks to Peter's room and sees him lying dead in his bed, covered in ants. Before she can scream, Peter suddenly wakes up. Annie realizes she has been sleepwalking again. Panicked, she asks Peter if Charlie is there. Peter, confused and hurt, asks why she seems afraid of him. Without thinking, Annie blurts out that she never wanted to be his mother. Peter is devastated and asks what she means. Annie admits that when she was pregnant with him, she tried to cause a miscarriage but failed. Her confession shifts into another disturbing vision. She sees herself once again standing over Peter and Charlie while they are covered in paint thinner. In the vision, she lights a match and sets Peter on fire. Suddenly, Annie opens her eyes and realizes it was only a dream. After some time, Annie rushes to Peter's room, wakes him up, and apologizes. She insists that he come downstairs with her. She gathers both Peter and Steve in the living room. They are confused and worried. Annie tells them she has been attending spiritual sessions and has learned how to communicate with Charlie. She claims she can act as a medium to speak to their daughter. Steve does not believe her and argues that she is only frightening Peter. However, Peter, desperate for answers, volunteers to help his mother. Annie makes them sit around the table. She holds their hands and asks them to place their fingers lightly on a glass. She tells them to focus on Charlie. Slowly, the glass begins to move on its own. Steve and Peter stare at it in shock and fear. Annie then places Charlie's diary on the table and asks her spirit to draw something, just like she used to. For a few long moments, nothing happens. Steve grows frustrated and tells Annie to stop. An argument breaks out between them, which only makes Peter more anxious. Suddenly, a glass shatters behind them, and the candle goes out. As Steve bends down to check under the table, Annie's body suddenly jerks. Charlie's spirit appears to take control of her, and she lets out a terrifying scream. Peter panics and begs Steve to do something. Steve quickly splashes water on Annie's face to snap her out of it. Annie gasps and looks around, confused and unaware of what just happened. The next day at school, Peter sits in class when he notices a strange beam of light, similar to the one Charlie once saw. Confused, he looks toward a mirror and is horrified to see his reflection smiling back at him on its own. Frightened, Peter rushes out of the classroom. Meanwhile, Annie is working when she receives a call from Steve. He tells her that Peter had a breakdown at school. Steve explains that Peter believes he is being followed by a vengeful spirit and even blames Annie for everything before hanging up. Annie becomes furious. As she tries to focus on her work again, she hears a voicemail from her employer demanding an update on her project. Overwhelmed and emotionally unstable, Annie loses control and begins destroying everything in her workshop. Later, Steve and Peter return home. When Steve goes to check on Annie, he finds the workshop completely wrecked. Among the destruction, he sees a headless miniature figure of Peter, which deeply disturbs him. That night, Steve sleeps on the sofa in the living room. Annie heads toward her bedroom, but suddenly notices new sketches appearing in Charlie's diary. At the same time, Peter wakes up and sees Charlie standing in his room, staring at him. When he calls out to her, her head suddenly falls off and rolls away, turning into a ball. Out of nowhere, Annie lunges at Peter and begins choking him. Peter wakes up screaming, revealing it was a nightmare. Annie rushes in and tries to calm him down. However, Peter accuses her of choking him. Annie insists she only found him screaming as she was passing by. She begs him not to tell his father, promising that she will fix everything and make it stop. She takes the blame and assures him she will end it soon. Determined, Annie takes Charlie's sketchbook downstairs and tries to burn it. As the book catches fire, Annie suddenly feels her own arm burning. She quickly realizes she is somehow connected to the book. Before it spreads further, she extinguishes the flames. Panicked, Annie rushes to Joan's house. As she knocks on the door, it becomes clear that Peter, not Annie, is the true target of the ritual being performed inside Joan's home. Meanwhile, during break time at school, Peter is alone when he suddenly spots Joan across the field. She calls out his name and begins chanting strange words, claiming she is casting him out. Peter is confused and frightened by her behavior. At the same time, Annie rushes home and begins searching through her mother's belongings. She reads several books and slowly uncovers the truth behind the ritual. She learns about Lord Paimon, described as a powerful demon king who seeks a human host. Annie is horrified to discover that once the ritual begins, it requires the most vulnerable male body to complete the possession. As she continues searching, Annie finds a photo album. She is shocked to see that Joan was a close friend of her mother. Realizing the connection, she rushes upstairs and opens the attic door. Following a terrible smell and the sound of flies, Annie discovers a hidden body in the attic. As she moves closer, she realizes in horror that it is her mother's corpse. Overwhelmed, she vomits in shock. Back at school, Peter begins to feel strange again during class. Suddenly, his arm stiffens and slowly rises on its own. His classmates watch in fear as he struggles to breathe. Without warning, Peter violently slams his head against the desk. Once, then again, screaming in pain and terror. Steve arrives at the school to pick him up. Seeing his son in such a condition breaks him. On the drive home, he becomes emotional, overwhelmed by everything happening to their family. When they return home, Annie sees Peter's injured face and is devastated. She helps Steve carefully place him in bed. Annie tells Steve about the body in the attic and takes him upstairs to see it. Steve is horrified when he discovers the corpse. Annie then shows him old photographs of Joan with her mother, explaining that Joan was the one who introduced her to the seance. She blames Joan for manipulating her and dragging her into the ritual. However, Steve points out that it was Annie who desecrated her mother's grave earlier. Annie denies it at first, but then breaks down and admits that she has made terrible mistakes. She explains her connection to Charlie's sketchbook and reveals that it is filled with drawings of Peter. Annie becomes desperate. She begs Steve to burn the sketchbook along with her, believing it is the only way to save their son. Through tears, she apologizes to Steve and confesses her love for him one last time, telling him that he has always been the love of her life. Steve, confused and frightened, refuses to burn the book. In desperation, Annie grabs the sketchbook and throws it into the fireplace herself. But this time, instead of Annie catching fire, Steve suddenly bursts into flames. Annie watches in horror as he burns alive, powerless to stop it. After some time, Peter wakes up and notices the house is completely silent. He slowly walks downstairs and is shocked to see his father's burned body lying on the floor. Peter turns and is horrified to see a man standing in the shadows, smiling at him. Suddenly, Annie appears and attacks him. Terrified, Peter runs to the attic and climbs up the ladder, locking himself inside. Outside the door, Annie begins violently banging her head against it. Crying, Peter begs his mother to forgive him. After a few moments, the banging suddenly stops. Peter slowly turns around and is shocked to see his photograph placed inside a strange black magic symbol drawn on the floor. The eyes in the picture are scratched out. His vision begins to blur as strange noises fill the attic. He looks up and freezes in horror. Annie is floating in the air, using a thin wire to slowly saw off her own head. Panicked, Peter notices 3 mysterious elderly figures standing nearby, smiling at him. Overwhelmed with fear, he jumps out of the attic window. After some time, he regains consciousness outside. As if in a trance, he begins walking toward the treehouse. On his way, he sees several naked people standing silently in the shadows, smiling at him. When he climbs into the treehouse, he sees Charlie's severed head placed on a mannequin-like figure. Around it, the group of people kneel and bow. Peter also sees the lifeless bodies of Annie and Steve lying before the figure. Strangely, he shows no emotion, as if his mind can no longer process what is happening. A woman gently places a crown that once belonged to Charlie onto Peter's head. She welcomes him as Paimon, one of the 8 kings of hell. She addresses him as Charlie, explaining that they have removed her weak female body and given her a stronger male host. The people bowed down before Peter, chanting and praising him as Paimon. The movie ends with Peter standing silently as the cult worships him.